So going then into how we can start making more sense of this spatially, using the Case IH farm platform, we can really start linking into, it's simple to upload the data, start linking into the different yield layers, protein layers, and really working back through where the opportunities are in a field. So just simply working through the client farm field, getting through, make sure we're in that 2020 year for that harvest data. And going to field 23 was one of the wheat paddocks from last year, just as a bit of a snapshot to run through essentially how the field's starting to zone up. So when we have a look here, this is the yield across the field. And yeah, we can see that variation between the higher and lower ends there. Just in these fields, we've got the lower yielding zones through the middle here. And yeah, you were touching on, I guess, Tim or Brian or John, just around the variation that you might be able to explain here, just from the yield side of things, that soil type related or anything sort of that you can see a pattern there just from that yield perspective.
I think it's really interesting, Ed, that when we look at that paddock and speaking with our cropping coordinator, who obviously drives all the implements, he doesn't really notice anything really different in the middle of the paddock. There's certainly, with that particular paddock, there's a ridge that runs on the right hand, as we're looking at it, on the right hand side, where the top fence takes a little bit of a dip. It runs right down to the bottom. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sort of. There's a ridge there, and it sort of drops off and goes into a more heavier sodic type soil because that is prone to flooding. You can see a tree line.
Yes.
Where that's like a creek line in flood time. So that's what we know, that difference there. But this bit in the middle is really interesting, and I guess when we look back at the history of this paddock, there has been quite a bit of research done the last few years in particular. Back in 2019, there was a research program in the top third, and the couple of years previous to that, there was a research program down in the bottom third. So apart from that, we don't notice any particular soil differences, and yeah, it's certainly worth investigating further. That's for sure.
Yeah, okay, interesting. So then when we start looking at, those fields, so that's the yield layer, we can then come through to I'll just go through that bit again. So yeah, as we go through, that's the yield layer. We can then come through and down to the crop health section where we've already uploaded the protein layers. So we can then start looking at this protein in relation to those yield layers, and as you can start seeing, you start picking up. There's some low yield, low protein areas, as you can see as we fade between the two layers there. Protein going back to yield. We've got some areas that are low yield, low protein, and a lot of people expect there as soon as you get the lower yield, you're going to get the higher protein. But we're actually getting sort of that coupled low yield and low protein in a couple of these zones. So we can flick back and forward on that, essentially showing that distribution of that protein across the field. So we've got that higher protein sitting up on this upper third, like we're touching on before. Then again, we've sort of got this middle zone, and then we've got this third zone down through here again. When we break that down, we do the analysis on the correlation quadrant, let's call it. So we just come down, and in this crop health layer, we can actually break it down into all the different layers we've been able to upload. Select the correlation quadrant, and then that's essentially doing that work for us. So essentially, instead of fading back and forth, it's actually just zoning it up into our four quadrant zones. So you can see that low yield, low protein zone in the middle in the red showing up really strongly. The green we can see on that upper third is really is where our sort of that sweet spot, that high yield, high protein zone is. And there's a bit of yellow coming through that. So you can see there'll be a few zones there. You just say, right, let's patch some of these yellow zones out up here because they're obviously getting really close to being a green zone. So for me, some of these areas up here would be real sort of, I call it the low-hanging fruit on saying, right, let's just tweak some of the nitrogen rates up here, would be perfect to sort of get all those yellow zones up into the green. And then similarly down here in this bottom section, again, that yellow zone. So it's defined, we've got the yield, so we've had the moisture availability out of these soils. We just haven't had enough in there from last year essentially to fuel that grain. And yeah, 2020 being the year that it was. I guess just your nitrogen strategy from last year, I guess looking at this data, would have you sort of, knowing this, you felt you probably could have gone with another application last year, or were you sort of content with how you managed it from last year?
I think when you look at it, we and the way the year finished off, had we known we were going to get a finish like that, we probably potentially would have put a bit more in on. But I guess it's always been a little bit of a conservative approach here, so we didn't try to push anything too hard last year. But I'm sort of looking at those results here. There probably was the potential to actually apply a bit more in there.
Yeah, so I guess that's where I'd be looking as a starting point, and then really on the flip side. So this is where we start linking through into some of the as we go forward onto some of the strategies around how we then use some of this data to potentially set up some soil testing zones and actually get some confidence in some of this data and then move forward from it. So from the starting point, I guess we'll just strip it back to even just looking at the N removal is as a starting point. So we can see these zones that have been defined by that removal. But it tells you what's essentially been removed. It's a great starting point for what needs to be replaced, but it doesn't really give you that indicator of why it was held back. And that's where you're looking at the correlation quadrant. Often find is a better zoning tool for defining the reapplication or the variable rate application that next year usually is more accurate than just using a straight N removal, where something like the phosphorus is usually like a lot more solid, like having more confidence on the phosphorus removal in relation to a replacement program. So just from that yield protein data, we can see that there's those different spreads around that P to N removal. Yes, there's some of them are sitting in similar zones, but you can also see that there are some slightly different patterns that are occurring. So we've also got the sulfur up in there as well. So I can tick them off and have the sulfur up in, which is going to be similar to your nitrogen removal and also the potassium. So it's just understanding, putting some metrics around, even if you don't necessarily need to apply the fertilizers to replace them always, it's just trying to work out, get a bit of a gauge on what we are removing. And then critically, it's then coming back to say, in this correlation quadrant, how do we get a strategy then to work forward on it? So basically by defining these zones, and what we're seeing is looking at some of the blue zones that come up in the field, remembering they're the lower yield, higher protein. So if we've had a blanket rate approach to this field, we can see we've got vast sort of differences in efficiency. Basically, a quarter of the field in each colour here has been broken down into primarily, really a third, the red, the yellow and the green, with some of the blue emerging there, being that moisture limited side of things. But like touched on, that spring sort of essentially pulled some of the crops out of that harder finish angle and sort of gave them fresh legs at the end there. So we'd be looking at saying, where's some of this blue zone, how much is N is carried over, how much legacy N have we got in some of those zones, but really understanding what's going on in this red zone, digging back into some of the history. Have we had, touched on that crop rotation in some of these other zones, and we've got a longer legacy issue in this middle zone, and it might be that it is just a nitrogen factor. So I'd be looking in this red zone and looking for, say, nitrogen, deep N testing, but also probably linking with potentially some subsoil constraint analysis. Is there higher sodium, is there boron or something coming in those subsoils that'd be worth looking at, just to tick them off. These yellow zones are really going to have exhausted the N relative to some of the other zones in the field. So when we do see a yellow zone, that has pulled out all the easy, call it easy access nitrogen out of these soils, because when they've been going to fill any bit of moisture they've been pulling in, they've been essentially trying to drive that nitrogen through the grain, and they've exhausted the full pool there. So it'd be having a more robust nitrogen strategy from the outset in these yellow zones. Have your standard rate essentially in your greens, but looking to top up some of these yellow zones. And then, like I say, ideally find out more on this red zone and say, do we just push it a bit harder from a nitrogen strategy, or is there something else holding these soils back?